My name is Paul Franklin and I'm a visual effects supervisor working in the film industry, and I've worked on films including Inception, Interstellar and the Dark Knight trilogy, all of which I made with Christopher Nolan.
So my name is Oliver James. Over the last 20 years I've worked on a lot of films. Highlights probably James Bond, Quantum of Solace, Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions, Inception, and most recently Interstellar.
My name is Ian Hunter. I'm the creative director and visual effects supervisor for New Deal Studios in Los Angeles, California. And I have worked on a lot of feature films throughout my career. I kind of jokingly work on a lot of man movies, Batman, Superman, Iron Man, Spider-Man, etc.
The visual effects supervisor on a film is responsible for designing and then executing the visual effects. So the VFX supervisor has to work very closely with the filmmaker, with the director, working out how to use visual effects to tell the story that the filmmaker wants to tell. And that's very much a creative process, but it's also a technical one, because obviously visual effects are very technically involving. And so part of my job is to ensure that things are being shot correctly on set, that we're getting the right information, and that everything's being put together in the correct fashion during post-production. And that's really where my job comes into its own, because that's where I'm working with a very large team of visual effects artists. I'm looking at their work, trying to make sure that we're maintaining creative continuity, but also that we're maintaining technical standards. So it's essentially visual effects is like a mini movie inside the bigger part of the film.
Research and development is basically software engineering, but it's often when we get a new film, we'll have a meeting before production starts, and we'll outline all the challenges that we're faced with. And often there's some new things in there, so things that we haven't tackled before. Maybe it might be a matter of scale, might be complexity. So the research and development team will get involved at that stage and work out if we need to write any new software. So design any new techniques, write software, or even build hardware.
We do visual effects that involve practical effects, meaning that we actually build and photograph objects that then later become part of a composite or a matte painting, etc. So it's visual effects, but it's from a practical background.
I first became involved in visual effects about 25 years ago, and I originally studied fine art at university. I was a sculptor, but I was very interested in using computers to make graphics and to visualize my sculpture. And I found that you could animate these things, make them move, which was very exciting to me. I'd always wanted to make kinetic animated sculptures, and I could do this inside the computer. And then I found there was this new emerging field of digital visual effects, where people were making computer animations, manipulating images digitally and putting them into movies. And I'd always loved movies, particularly science fiction and adventure films, and so this was a brilliant new field which brought together everything I was interested in. And so I started out originally working, I worked initially as a games animator for a British games company, and then I moved into television. I worked in advertising and long form TV, but I gravitated towards feature film, because feature film focuses on storytelling. Everything else is telling stories, but for other reasons. Advertising is about selling things, for example. In feature film, you get a little bit more time to think about very specific responses to creative challenges, and I've been doing that for pretty much the last 20 years.
Well, many years ago, I actually wanted to be in aerospace, and I went to school briefly to be in aerospace, and I was told by my advisor that an aerospace engineer doesn't actually build airplanes. And I actually like to use my hands and get involved and go from concept to completion in terms of taking on a project, a task, a challenge, building something, and then seeing it through. So film seemed like a natural thing to do. I didn't think I could get into it, but I was able to get into filmmaking primarily as a model maker first, and then that model making led to doing more visual effects work.
Probably when I was 10 years old, I was given a programmable calculator, and I managed to catch the first wave of home computers. So in England we had Clive Sinclair and his ZX80 and ZX81. So I learned to program on those, and at school, and then I got a job at IBM before I went to university. At university I studied physics, and then after that I decided to do something which had always been a passion, which was photography. I got a job in a photographic studio and swept floors, made coffee, but also learnt everything about the photographic business. I was printing, developing, lighting, setting up cameras, organising shoots. But after a few years of that, I was starting to miss the physics and the math side of it. And I started looking for a way to combine them. And I came across a company called the Computer Film Company in London. And they took me on for a month. And that month suddenly stretched out to 6 years. And after that, I had a friend who I'd worked with, and he is setting up a company in California, ESC Studios. So I ended up getting work for them, working on Matrix Revolutions and Reloaded. I was there for a couple of years, then came back to London, and that's really how I ended up at Double Negative.
Go for main engine start, T-minus 10.
We must confront the reality that nothing in our solar system can help us.
9.
I've got kids, Professor. How long would I be gone?
8.
I'm asking you to trust me.
7.
Murph. You have to talk to me, Murph.
6.
I need to fix this before I go.
You have no idea when you're coming back.
5. Main engine start.
Couldn't you have told her you were going to save the world?
No.
I became involved with Chris Nolan back in 2003. That was the first time I worked on one of his films. It was on Batman Begins, the first of his Dark Knight Batman trilogy. And what was really interesting there was it was very much a learning experience for both of us, because I'd never worked with a filmmaker quite like Chris before, who is very focused, very determined. He has a very clear idea of what he wants. But also Chris had never really worked with visual effects before. He'd never used visual effects to any great extent in his other movies. And so we were both sort of learning how the other person wanted to work. And now we've made 5 films together, and I've got a very good idea of how he likes to work, what he wants to see in his film, the kind of solutions that he's going to not want in his film, so I'm not going to offer him things that I think are not going to work for him. And he's also got now a very good understanding of the visual effects process. He understands the time it takes to create things, what you need in order to be able to do stuff, that you can't just magic images out of the air, that it's in fact very much like any other part of the filmmaking process.
Christopher Nolan is a filmmaker who believes very strongly in the image that he's getting on screen. And to him, shooting something live or for real is almost like you're documenting the story or documenting the event. So I sort of half-jokingly say, if he had the time and money, he would have gone to space to make the movie. The next best thing was, in this case, to use miniatures. And because miniatures, despite the fact that they're small, they're still physical objects and they still react to light the same way. So if you photograph a miniature the correct way, it looks real, because the camera is fooled into believing that it's looking at a full-size object if you know how to photograph it correctly.
He's a very collaborative filmmaker. It's his film. You watch his movie, it's got Chris's personality all over it, but he very much encourages his creative leads to be full collaborative partners in the process. And so, from a creative point of view, working with Chris is incredibly satisfying, because he lets you get on with it and come up with your best ideas, and then you can have a discussion about whether it works in the movie or not. So you're not being told it must look like this. And as a result, I think he gets the very best out of everybody that works with him.
On Interstellar, my company, New Deal Studios, did the miniatures for it, and that means that we built models of the spaceships. So I sort of jokingly say that we put the inter in Interstellar, and that we actually make the connecting piece from the Earth to space by building the spaceships. This is our 4th time working on one of Christopher Nolan's movies. We started with working on Dark Knight, and then we worked on Inception, and then we worked on Dark Knight Rises, and then finally we've worked on Interstellar. So this is our fourth collaboration with him, and the most elaborate in terms of the amount of screen time and the importance of what we were contributing to the film for the visual effects side.
4.
When you become a parent,
3.
one thing becomes really clear.
2.
And that's that you want to make sure your children feel safe.
1.
One of the things that's interesting about what we do is, in this day and age, miniatures used to be the de facto way of creating a physical object and photographing it in visual effects. Of course, now most of that is done digitally, which is you're creating synthetic digital version of an object and outputting that, and there's no physical version of it. But in this particular case, we went to use miniatures instead, which are physical objects.
The first film we worked on was Batman Begins. That's when I moved to double negative, and that was through Paul Franklin, who is our visual effects supervisor. Now, what I understood at the time is Christopher Nolan didn't like the idea of visual effects in his films. He wanted to do everything practically. But on Batman Begins, he realized there's some things he couldn't do practically. So we did a few shots in that film, ended up being quite a lot of shots. And slowly the relationship between double negative and Christopher Nolan has grown, and with that confidence he's gained in us and our work, it's given us like a longer and longer leash to do more and more ambitious and complicated work.
There are a lot of things that miniatures get automatically that you have to work harder to do in the digital realm. The way it reflects light, the way you get texture, color, and in some cases action. When we are building a miniature, sometimes we have to destroy it. In all of Mr. Nolan's movies, we've had to take our models and destroy them in some way for the story or for the plot. And that is something that a miniature gives you a simulation of a physical event because it's actually happening. All we're doing as filmmakers is photographing them and getting this on camera. And Christopher Nolan also likes we call them the happy accidents. If you're shooting something as a miniature and it blows up, or it crashes or does whatever it's supposed to do, you get things that occur naturally that in the digital world you would have to think through and have to run simulations to get a natural feel that automatically occurs when you're doing it with a miniature. So those are the advantages of using a miniature, is you get a lot of real data because it's real.
Chris Nolan, as everybody knows, likes to shoot on film, and also we finish the film on film as well. We photochemically process everything. We do all the color timing in the lab. We don't use a digital intermediate.
Chris is a proponent of shooting on film. He insisted that we also shoot on film. We shoot on both film and digital in our past work, but in this case we shot on VistaVision, which is a film format that uses 35mm film, but it runs horizontally. So it's an 8 perf instead of 4 perf format. You get a larger negative. And this allowed us to photograph our miniatures and have them composited into what would ultimately be an IMAX blow-up. So not only does Chris believe a lot in film, he also believes in using the IMAX format, which is a really large film format. The quality of the image that you get from film is still, well, he feels is still superior to that which you get from digital. And the nuances and color and everything, is still quite spectacular with film. And so we shoot our miniatures the same way so that they can be included in his films and be part of his narrative.
We get the original negative, we scan it at the highest possible quality, so the IMAX images are scanned at 8K, and we take that into the computers, we work on the images, but then we put them back out onto film, we shoot them back onto a negative, and the idea is that we return a piece of negative to the cutting room that is identical in all important respects to the rest of the camera original negative. The 35mm component of the film, which is we shoot, Interstellar is a combination of 65mm 15 perf IMAX and 4 perf 35mm anamorphic Panavision cameras, and the the anamorphic CinemaScope portion is scanned at 4K. So that's our minimum working resolution is 4K. We don't do anything at 2K. 35mm material is scanned back out at 4K, and the IMAX material is scanned out at 5,600 by 4,000 lines. So they're pretty big frames. They're lower resolution than a camera original IMAX negative, but they're much higher resolution than any other image that's being put into the cinema these days. So there's no digital process which comes close to the resolution of full photochemical IMAX.
In terms of IMAX, that adds a challenge. We work with roughly 23 million pixels in IMAX image, so that focuses our attention. Like in the black hole renderer, very expensive to calculate the trajectory of a single beam of light, and most renderers try and shoot tens or hundreds of rays per pixel. So I try to limit that to just 1 ray per pixel in order to keep the render times sane. So I saw that at the BFI IMAX in London. No, it's spectacular. There's a shot I remember of the Endurance just going, a tiny little dot of light going in front of Saturn. And in IMAX you can see it's the Endurance, and you can see little details and little scintillations. And when I saw that shot, I was trying to imagine what it would look like at low resolution, and it would lose so much.
What are you going to do with it?
I'm going to give it something socially responsible to do.
Can't we just let it go?
This thing needs to learn how to adapt, Murph.
Gang, let's mask up.
Like the rest of us.
And it does put some, I wouldn't say restraints on the visual effects process, but it does mean you have to consider various things that you perhaps wouldn't in a fully digital process, which is fine with me because I've been doing visual effects for a very long time. And when I first started making feature film effects back in the 1990s, everybody worked this way. We all did everything on film. We shot on film, we scanned the film, we made the images digitally, then we shot them back out onto a film negative, and it was color timed with the rest of the film in the laboratory. So for me, nothing has really changed. What is more of a challenge these days is, obviously, when I put together a very big team for something like Interstellar, there's a lot of young guys who've never worked in this way before, and they find it a bit strange. But fortunately, there's myself and my colleagues who've been doing this for a long time. We're there to guide them. The main thing is that film actually gives you a huge amount of flexibility. The resolution of film stock is still much higher than most digital film cameras, digital movie cameras will capture. Certainly when we're working with the IMAX process. An IMAX negative has a resolution equivalent to 18,000 lines. So it's 9 times the resolution of the nearest HD image that's being used in cinema right now. The other thing is that film has a great deal, fantastic latitude. The exposure range within film is amazing, and digital cameras are beginning to get there, but it's not quite there yet. The other thing is that a film image is it has an inherent quality to it, which I think is inherently artistic, which is not really there with the digital stuff. In order to make a digital movie, you have to do a lot of things to it to make it feel like a film, and people do that regardless of whether they say, "Oh no, I'm doing this film entirely digitally." They're still treating it to look like a film. So it's an imitation. It's an approximation of something that we already get from the photochemical process. Sometimes you think, oh, this is so difficult because I've got to put it onto a print and the print hasn't come out right and it gets scratched, or it jams in the projector and it catches fire. But you have the satisfaction of knowing that your film will last for decades, possibly hundreds of years.
It's interesting you mentioned about the impact difference between seeing on film versus digital, especially in the IMAX world. We've had discussions with him briefly about 3D, and in some ways 3D creates a barrier, is that some films do really well because you create depth, and seeing into the space is actually better than having things poking out at you. But in the IMAX format, because it fills your frame, your field of view, it actually feels very immersive, and you get very absorbed into the space. To me, the most impactful thing I've seen on IMAX is the truck flipping over from Dark Knight. That to me was spectacular because it just felt so awesome, and I'm looking at this thing coming down on us. So when we go to shoot the miniatures for Interstellar, when we shot them, it was really important to us to create this very intense image that filled frame that could sustain itself on screen for a long time. And that's the thing that's different about Chris's movies also, is that his shots are not very, they're not super quick, and especially in Interstellar, he dwells on the scene. He wants you to absorb the shot and feel the emotion. And so for us, the miniatures had to be very detailed, the paintwork had to be very good, and the lighting had to be excellent, so that richness in the image was something you could take a still of what we shot, and you could take a still of anything else in the movie, and it would be a beautiful photograph. And that was the kind of feeling we were trying to go for, which is to have a sustained emotional image that people could just absorb and dwell on.
Chris Nolan has got a fantastic grasp of his filmmaking process. One of the things that really strikes you if you come onto a Nolan film and you've never worked on one before, is that the first draft of the script you read is pretty much the draft that we end up shooting and that ends up on the screen. Because he already knows what he wants to make. He's not trying to find his way to a film. Some things will evolve. We'll find that things develop as we go along. A good example is the design of the black hole in Interstellar. That came out of a physics research process that we went through, where we collaborated with a scientist, Kip Thorne, our executive producer and scientific advisor. Kip is one of the great physicists of the modern era, and Kip gave us the physics and the mathematics that describe the black hole, and this dictated the shape of it, how it actually looked like. But we didn't know what it would look like until we'd written all the software that could implement Kip's physics.
It took us over a year to develop the software to get the final pictures. The fun for me was relearning physics. I'd stopped. I got as far as my bachelor's degree, and I sort of read physics, but I hadn't really studied it properly. And then having to quickly learn all about relativity and try and understand that. And I had absolutely the best teacher in the world, Kip Thorne, who's one of the world's foremost authorities in gravitation, sort of teaching me. So I knew it was a fantastic opportunity that whenever I had a question, I could email him, and I would get an answer which was, it wasn't just an answer you might find on Wikipedia, his answer with real insight and simplifying it down to the simplest terms and stripping any extraneous detail. So he's the best teacher I could possibly have had.
This world's a treasure, but it's been telling us to leave for a while now.
Your daughter's generation will be the last to survive on Earth. You're the best pilot we ever had. Get out there and save the world.
And then when we get to post, Chris wants to see the work every single day through post. We don't have twice weekly reviews. It's a daily review every day. And some people might find that a little bit overwhelming, but the great thing is you put an image in front of Chris and he'll give you an opinion immediately that will move it along. He never goes away and says, I just need to think about this, I don't really know how this works. He knows. And that is fantastic from the point of view of somebody like me. It's you've got a leader who knows where he's going.
I feel, having worked with him 4 times, that he considers visual effects shots to be any other shot in his movie. He always has us shoot them full length so that he can take them and edit them as he pleases. So that I think it's great, because it means that he feels visual effects are as integral to his storytelling as any other shot in his film. When it came to Interstellar, we had moved the company to the valley side of Los Angeles, and then he became available. He finished shooting Principal, which was shot in Los Angeles, and so at the point when we started doing the miniatures, he was able to come down and actually meet with us, but only a couple of times. Again, show him dailies, he gives us notes, and we apply those notes. But he has a great understanding of visual effects, and especially in our case, visual effects photography, miniature photography. So it was very easy to converse with him in terms of things like frame rate and exposure and everything else.
I think the biggest challenges are always the creative ones. And increasingly these days, visual effects artists need to spend the majority of their time thinking about why are we making this image rather than how are we going to make it, because you can find a solution. You can always find a solution to making an image, but working out what should be in the image in the first place and how it tells a story is the hardest thing. So one of the biggest creative challenges I think I've ever faced was the design of the Tesseract environment in Interstellar, which is the multi-dimensional environment that Matthew McConaughey's character Cooper finds himself in at the end of the film when he falls into the black hole. And this was something where Chris, his initial briefing to me was that it's an environment in which time is visible as a physical dimension. And we looked at all sorts of different things, the way that, as I say, artists had approached this, cinematographic techniques like slit scan that makes a record of time in the image. And you know, this all then fed into this very, very complex environment which we ultimately designed and then collaborated with the art department to construct on a stage in Los Angeles.
Everybody ready to say goodbye to our solar system? To our galaxy. Here we go.
I prefer 2D, to be honest. I find 3D is great. I loved Avatar. I thought that looked fantastic in 3D. But most films, I find the 3D effect, they push it too hard. And I think I'm probably old-fashioned in that respect. I like to see something flat and just absorb myself in it. I don't need 3D glasses to get absorbed into it.
No 3D unless it's good 3D. Bad 3D is bad. You know, it's hard to watch. I mentioned earlier that to me, where 3D is very effective is depth. Actually, depth. You know, I think the cliche, the gimmick of having things coming at you gets old, and you know once it breaks that proscenium, it doesn't actually work in some ways, and you're always trying to constantly look for that, you know, grab something that's in front of you. Where on the other hand, you know, the one thing I did appreciate about Avatar was the depth of the scenes, you know, the feeling of vastness. You know, you're flying over the forest, or you see those rocks or whatever. That's where I think 3D is very effective. Also, you know, like Gravity had a feeling too in space. You know, you had that depth cue. So I think that is a really good thing. But I've also found, as we've discussed earlier, that IMAX, a big, large, intense format, also gives you great immersive feeling. And I just think, you know, I work in both mediums. We do VR, where we're shooting in 3D and 360. I think that looks great. I shoot digital, I shoot film, I do DI, I work on films that are the other way. So I don't have any preference over 3D or 2D. I just think the right story for the right format.
I don't mind. I'm happy working in either. I haven't had that much experience of working in 3D and stereo. I did a little bit on one of the Harry Potter films a few years ago. I think it's a fascinating process. I think there are all sorts of different ways to tell stories that we're really only just scratching the surface in the use of 3D cinema. But obviously, working with Chris, you know, we don't make our films in 3D. We are embracing a different approach to the immersive experience, which is using IMAX, creating a huge image that you can feel like you fall into. It dominates your vision with these big, brilliant, clear images. The digital IMAX presentation, it's still pretty impressive, but it doesn't have the sharpness and the brilliance of the full 70mm IMAX, and the images don't go as big. You know, the Bradford screen is a huge screen, and the one down in London, the BFI, is also absolutely enormous. You know, I think it's the biggest IMAX screen in Europe. So that's when you see those big images projecting onto those screens, it's a pretty overwhelming experience.
My partners saw Interstellar in OmniMax, which is projected on a dome. So it was 70mm film on the dome. So instead of seeing a flat screen in front of you, the screen wrapped around you. So in fact, the edges started to go off, and you actually were sort of in the space even more. So I didn't get to see it that way, but I wish I had.
I think digital projectors have come on a long way. They're still not as bright as a regular film projector. And as I say, you know, the resolution, if you're not watching a 4K projector, I think a good 35mm exhibition print has more resolution than a digital projector. I think people sometimes mistake sort of the high contrast ratios used in some digitally produced films. They mistake that for resolution because you up the contrast in an image, and there's always this sense of perceived higher resolution. So I think that's slightly misleading. I don't think it really matters, but of course the reality is that most of the screens out there are now digital. There are inescapable financial arguments for going digital, but I do think we're losing something. We don't have expert projectionists who really understand what they're doing. I was at a cinema recently in London watching a film with my kids, and the aspect ratio was set incorrectly on the projector, and I knew exactly what was wrong with it, the way that they set the thing up. But nobody in the cinema understood it, and I had to spend 15 minutes explaining it to the staff until eventually they got somebody to go and find the right menu options and change it on the projector and switch it back. And it was just that somebody had forgotten to change it back over from the previous, whatever they'd been doing previously with the projector. I think they used it for a conference or something like that. And in the old days you'd have a projectionist whose job was to maintain the projector and the quality of the projection. Now what you have is you have a central server and somebody just presses go, and the projectors supposedly never need focusing. They have locked off focus rings. But I don't think it's quite there yet. I think that's just people justifying an economic argument.
So for me, the biggest advantage of digital projection is actually having a flicker-free image and having the stable image. That's the one thing I've really noticed in digital. And now the colors are as good. The resolution is probably similar as well, so I like digital.
When I was talking or up for the Academy Award, we have something called the Bake Off, which is where you present the reels and then the Academy members decide who is going to be nominated. So while I was there talking to my colleagues who are all in the visual effects business, they said, oh, the film looked spectacular, it was beautiful, it must have been really interesting in the DI and the digital intermediate process to set all the colors. And I said, no. Christopher Nolan still uses color timing. He still uses film color timing processes to do his output. So even though it was filmed digitally composited, once the digital composite was done, it was then output on film again, and the color correction was done in the photochemical process. I think having a strong vision is what's important, and I think what happens so often with the reason why I like shooting miniatures, and the reason why I like shooting with directors who like shooting miniatures, and in this particular case why the DI versus film process in terms of color correcting is preferred, is I like people with strong visual ideas and who have a very clear vision in mind. And what's happened now is there's the ability to manipulate the image any way you want up until the end. The DI gives you a great ability to do that. Digital visual effects give you the great ability to do that. You can change people's dialogue, you can remove people, you can add people, things like this. And so what's happened though, unfortunately, is the decision-making process gets left to the end. And people, instead of having a clear vision and then applying that vision and directing the crew to do that, they have half visions and look for hopefully better solutions. And so there's a mediocrity actually to film now that occurs where things get sort of left and there's designed by committee and there's not a very clear, strong vision. And I think that's where I personally like the DI process, but I like the DI process when someone photographs something in a very bold manner and then uses it to tweak it or to adjust it. I don't like when people shoot something in a very neutral manner and hope that they can find their look in the post process. It's not the way to make films. You have to have a clear vision.
We have a mission. Our mission does not work if the people on Earth are dead by the time we pull it off.
Well, we got this far, farther than any human in history.
Oh, not far enough.
Make it count.
Where's the mountains?
Those aren't mountains. They're waves.
The personally most rewarding one, well, I gotta say it's gotta be Interstellar, because our contribution to it was very intrinsic And of course, we were rewarded very well by both the BAFTA and the Academy Award. And I also personally really enjoyed the movie and felt very strongly. I've seen it many times, and I think it's a great film. And I think my business partner put it best after we saw the movie for the first time. She came up to me and she said, if we never work on another movie again, at least we worked on that one.
I would say from a creative point of view, the most satisfying project has definitely got to be Interstellar.
No, it's one of the most satisfying projects I've ever worked on.
We've gone so far with visual effects in terms of creating reality from non-reality, creating reality from a digital standpoint. There's this conference earlier today, or not today, but yesterday, about digital people. And, there's going to be a lot of solves in terms of like creating synthetic persons that are going to get better and better and more believable. So I think there's a point where we're going to be able to create fairly believable, completely believable environments and characters that are not necessarily physically based. That will come. But will that be fun? I don't know. There's something to be said for the effort, the truth that comes out of doing something for real. And I think a combination of the two is really where we should be looking. Like I said, we work in VR, virtual reality, a lot, and there's a lot of camps that want to strictly work in digital, and there's some camps that want to work in shooting things practically, recording live events. And because of our visual effects background, what we've found is sometimes when we shoot something for real, we need to go back in and add digital effects in terms of removing artifacts or adding elements and things like this. And so I ultimately think what's going to really work, and it's going to be the merger of recording live events and then manipulating them in digital, recording and creating 3D worlds based on real world recording. And then once you've got that record, is then have the creativity go back and change it. So that's what's exciting to me, is the idea of creating a whole very manipulative environment with the tools that we have now.
You might have to decide between seeing your children again and the future of the human race.
We'll find a way. We always have.